as an organisation for how you can get ready to respond to some of these requirements. As James mentioned, it's not all about price and just having those kind of key business elements in applications for work or for funding, but actually having some element of understanding of your impact and your data can be really important, and your carbon footprint is often a relevant way to do that. But an organisation's carbon footprint is split up into 3 different scopes, and they kind of come with various different levels of direct control and ability to collect the data and calculate those. So your scope 1 is your direct emissions, so it's the fuel used in your vehicles and the gas in your buildings. Scope 2 is your purchased electricity, and then scope 3 is 15 other different categories, which you can see on the slide there, across things like your purchased goods and services, your travel, your investments, how your items to get to you, the capital goods that you own, your waste. So it's a number of different areas within that you may or may not be able to calculate. But the reason why having a base level understanding, at least of some of these categories that you can calculate and that you do have access to the data for, allows you to make appropriate areas for developing action. So without an understanding of your data, you might be making incorrect assumptions about which areas to focus actions on, and actually spending a bit of time at least just thinking through where you think your biggest impact might be, as opposed to going straight to some of the sort of generic guidance tailored at different things that organisations can do, will really add a lot of meaning to your engagement with sustainability, and that will really come through when you evidence it for things like tenders, for example.
Nothing loses the audience like talking about scope 3 supply chain emissions. I find it's not the most exciting. What 3 of us find it fascinating, but you might not. So I like to visualize, why does this matter? And oftentimes when we're talking about this, you can be thinking about being a supplier if you're trying to win a tender or a university or that kind of thing, but also often you have your own supply chain. So we need to think about it in both ways, but obviously we're talking more about you being a supplier. And I've got a little visual here for those who are more visually inclined, for you to think about why we're doing this and why this matters. So I really like that as an analogy. If you think about the university, for example, or whoever you're trying to win business from, they've got their own massive environmental targets, they've got various ethical targets and things like that. And imagine it's like a mountain to climb. As the supplier, you're the backpack we have to carry, right? So we of course want the smallest, lightest, most efficient ones that we can get. And in terms of things like the university and a lot of large organizations, the procurement, well, certainly our scope 3, when Alice showed you the carbon scopes earlier, our scope 3 is 70% of our carbon emissions. It's huge, but it's also the bit we have the least influence over. So the only way we can influence it is to decide who we're going to spend our money with. So it makes sense for us that you are as lean and efficient as we can possibly have. The problem is that level of influence. So other than who we buy with, this is obviously why we do these kind of engagement opportunities, so we can talk to you and we can work with you about how we can reduce that and keep you as lean as possible, but also in getting good data, because a lot of the data that we have to use is spend-based. And the only way to reduce our spend-based emissions by spending less, and as our supplier, you don't want us to do that. You want us to choose you because of all the other things that James talked about, the quality or your social value and those sorts of things. So it's about that being measurable so that we can choose you instead of going for the cheapest, because that's not what we want. We want high quality and we want really good data.
And so as a way to kind of help organisations to be able to collect that data and gather that data and be able to provide that, we wanted to just reassure you, I suppose, that if you're starting from a position now where you haven't measured your carbon footprint, you haven't gathered the data at all, you don't need to go from 0 to 100, and the university itself, as Sandra mentioned, hasn't gone from 0 to 100% data confidence. It's a process, but the earliest that you start this process, the better that will be for sort of everybody within your supply chain. But you can start from using things like simple online tools, some of the tools that James mentioned that we have available for you, which will be in the description of this video, and some resources that we can send to you. And it is quite easy to find some of that data that is within your control and use that. You can then move on to things like those spend-based measurements, like Sandra mentioned, that will give you an indication of where your biggest impacts are that you can then start to work directly with as part of longer-term actions. Going up to higher confidence level of data for things like that are activity-based, so where you can work with your supplier, and this is what the university is trying to do now, work with suppliers to get actual data based on their actual activities that we can have a lot more confidence in. That might vary differently by sector. So some sectors have a lot more traceability and engagement with sustainability at this stage. Things like where they're paper-based and have to have FSC certification, for example, or some manufacturing organisations will have a lot more engagement with this because they've been asked to do it for a lot longer. But as an organisation in any industry, at some point you'll be in the supply chain of an organisation that's looking at taking action. It will require everybody within the supply chain. So the earlier that you can start, the better. And another way that you can help present this and provide information to your supply chain in the best way is through putting together the information that you'll gather as part of those processes into a plan. And that plan can then, one, help guide your own actions, but also help evidence those actions to your supply chain. And this is what we're increasingly finding that supply chains are asking for. So either they all mean the same thing, but a sustainability action plan, a carbon reduction plan, a net zero plan or policy, essentially they're all booking down to what are you doing for sustainability, what's your current data look like, and how are you going to reduce that? And so as part of those, the two sort of main parts that you'll likely be asked to provide to evidence for those things is your carbon footprint calculations and what you're doing to reduce those, your actions that you are either already taking or are going to take in the future based on that data. Oh yes, so as I mentioned, in the Net Zero Supply Carbon Tool or on the Greener Future Leicestershire website, where there'll be more information in the description and the resources alongside this video.
So thinking about, for example, from a university point of view, if you're looking at calculating your own Scope 3 supply chain emissions or putting together a action plan of your own, I strongly suggest using one of the calculators that Alice just mentioned, and we'll link to them, and not making assumptions. You'll be surprised at where the emissions can come from. And it's not always what you think. You expect it to be buying equipment, construction and things like that. But for the university's point of view, for example, one of the hotspots that we found that really surprised me was we have a med school, was plastic gloves and pipettes. They are huge. These are massive things that the university is buying, tens of thousands of these all the time. We never really thought about the environmental impact of it. Obviously, we thought about disposal, but we haven't thought about it from a procurement point of view. And once we started calculating it, then it made us realise that we needed to actually start talking not only to the people doing the pressing the buttons and buying the stuff in the first place, but actually suppliers of this, and looking at what options are there in order to minimise. We need to use plastic gloves, right? It's infection control, it's an important thing, and we understand the need for it, but what can we do to minimise the environmental impact of something that we need to buy? And that involved people in James's team looking through our own catalogue, our own supply chain, and looking for what are the most environmentally positive or the least worst options, but also worked with the users, the end users, and they were looking at solutions within labs, things like that, for how they can minimise it. So having the data in the first place, looking at where the issues were, then led us to be able to put together for our own action plans what we can do to minimise the environmental impact. And that kind of stuff is really important. So internally, but also working with suppliers. So when you're looking at your own journey and what you're trying to put together, this is quite a useful, you always get the visual stuff. This is quite a useful slide, actually from Auditel. We didn't put it together, but it's really nice to think about where you are on your supply chain journey, and also to think about your own suppliers, where they are on theirs, and the people that you're supplying and where they are. We're all on different journeys, and as Alice said earlier, it's not necessarily linear. There's all different things that we can do. So the first thing is to find out your data, find out where your hotspots are, what the emissions are, and then to think about what you could do in terms of your supply chain. And some things are really simple, like just deliver less deliveries. You know, we worked out quite early on that we didn't need twice daily stationary deliveries to the university. It's rare that we need stationary urgently. So actually, by just consolidating, by working with our supplier to consolidate deliveries, just 1 or 2 a week, hugely reduced the environmental impact. Didn't affect what we bought from them, just when we bought it, and also reduced their costs, because then they weren't driving them up and down around the Midlands all the time. So it was just a very sensible conversation. But by having those conversations, they initiated that. It made sense for everybody. So those sorts of things. And then obviously you might get down to the stage where you are actually innovating products, to think about your packaging, think about the products themselves, and then doing what we're doing now, hopefully, which is leadership, which is to talk to your supply chain and talk to people to say, to normalize and say, what can we do about this? How can we do that? So, you know, they're very much understanding that we're all at different stages of this journey, and different parts of our supply chain might be at different levels of maturity along this. What if we were the worst supplier? How could we be the absolute worst supplier that the university or whoever we're trying to sell to definitely wouldn't want? And go through that as a fun exercise with your team. And it's generally around, you know, let's be really uncommunicative. Let's not respond to anything. Let's have really bad quality, or let's make greenwash claims and we'll say one thing. Let's not really think much about how well we treat our employees and things like that. So these are two really fun things like that, and then do the opposite. The other thing you can think about is your sphere of influence. So when we think about, particularly when you're putting your action plans and when you're putting things together, what do you have direct control over? So you hopefully have direct control over what it is you're selling, and you have direct control over where you do business and those sorts of things. You have less control over. So when Alice went through the cafe scene, there were things that you have direct control over, like, for example, the energy that powers the equipment that you buy. You may have less control over, for example, the equipment that you buy, because it might be that it's quite specialist, or, you know, we often have this. But one of the things that we're seeing as a university, even in funding bids now, funders are asking our academics to say, what is the equipment? Do you need it? Could you borrow someone else's? Could you hire it? You know, that kind of. If you do need to buy it, could you buy an energy efficient one? They're even asking us about the energy sources that are going to power said equipment. So are you on a green tariff? And you know, what's, you're using renewables, is that kind of stuff. And they're asking us about what we're going to do with that equipment at the end of the project. Often we only need things for a short amount of time. So if you're supplying that equipment, do you have a buyback? Yeah, can we send it back to you at the end of its life and you can use it for parts or whatever else? Are we able to get someone else to use it for that? So it's this whole costing thing. And some of these things you have control over. Some of these things, you know, we might think, well, I have no control over what I do with a piece of equipment at the end of it. But actually, if you're supplying us that, we can have that if we have that conversation. So do you want it back? Would that be useful for you at the end of it? So having those conversations and thinking about where our sphere of influence is and where maybe we can push that a little bit could be really useful. These are some of the ideas that we have come up with ourselves and come up with businesses that we've worked with in terms of sort of our upstream emissions that we can think about. I already mentioned the transport example, just sort of driving less to supply things, and thinking about where materials come from and who we're doing business with. This is obviously what we're thinking about as a university as well, in terms of who we're choosing. And in terms of those downstream emissions, again, a lot of things around packaging, only using what we need, and thinking about those sort of the scope 1 and 2 of the people that we're doing business with.
We've talked about ways that you can measure and reduce your business's carbon footprint, particularly in scope 3, and different actions that you can take to mitigate that. But there's another way of looking at it that we can touch on slightly as well, which is moving from simply being less bad to how can we limit the things that we're existingly doing, to shifting to doing business differently and thinking about how can we really innovate in this space, and is there any way we can transform to become a more sustainable and innovative business as a whole. So one of the things that might be driving that, and that is quite interesting in this space, is digital product passports, which are becoming mandatory for different products like batteries and textiles and electronics at the moment from the EU's Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation. And that's coming in place at the moment, I think between 2027 and 2030 for some of those particular industries. And this is very real legislation that's very really affecting how organisations will monitor their supply chain. So it's going to ask every organisation to have a digital product passport that essentially shows a QR code on the item of what it's made of, where that came from, how it's repaired, how it's disposed of, and that requires a lot of engagement among a supply chain to be able to provide that information. And that is something that's coming in as a very real piece of legislation and regulation in the EU, and that has very real implications for how businesses work across the EU, but also wider than that, and brings into the forefront of how businesses kind of design and operate, really, on thinking through the entire life cycle of your different products and how you track and measure that, and the intention really is to shift towards, away from these traditional models of doing business where you take materials, you make a product, you dispose of it. The reason that it's asking you to track and measure those things is so that we can see how much is being wasted. And actually, the solution to that is really more of a circular design. So can we design products and services in a way where we eliminate the use for waste? So actually we create a circular model that keeps that waste in use. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has really been leading a lot of this work, and they have set up a framework here, which I just thought I'd show as a way to provide you a bit of guidance and reflection on thinking through how this might work for your organisation, on how businesses in very real ways can transition to using that circular economy model throughout your operations. And it's got aspects on here for different things you can think across this Resolve framework of, can you shift the way that you use your materials? Can you think about how you might virtualize things, how you might keep things in use across different networks? So that's a framework that you could use to have a look at those different areas and think meaningfully about how they might relate to your organisation. The way that we've worked with organisations to do that, and you can find a lot of support on the Greener Future Leicestershire website, is through the creation of the Sustainability Action Plan that I mentioned earlier. And that's quite a simple framework for actually the majority of the work sits in you doing the thinking and the discussions within your organisation about how this is meaningfully for you and doing the work behind it. But the actual document itself is quite an easy and simple process for describing what this looks like for your organisation. So identifying different data that you've got, and we've talked you through how you might be able to do that. Setting goals, and again, making sure that they're meaningful to you as an organisation, but also maybe aligned to the goals of the organisations that you're trying to get into the supply chain for. So, for example, for the NHS, they require organisations within the supply chain to comply with net zero targets that align with their own. And that might also be smart to have a look at the net zero targets for the organisations that you're looking to be a supplier of, and to mimic those and try and set some meaningful targets aligned to theirs. And then identify actions, and we've talked through a lot of different ideas for how you might be able to do that and what actions might be relevant for you, and to put that together into a plan, publish that, have a bit of transparency about it, produce a narrative and a story around what sustainability looks like for you, why that's important for you, and altogether that can make it a lot easier to comply with some of these legislations that we've talked about, to meet the requirements of different suppliers, and to be able to kind of meaningfully engage in this space.